comprise the major structure of a landscape. They help us to organize space, and they also provide a number of benefits such as shade, either on a house or maybe a sitting area. They also contribute significantly to the beauty and value of the home. And so we want to make sure that when we're planting a tree, we put it in the proper place so that we can take advantage of all the benefits. From an aesthetic point of view, siting trees in the landscape can fall into either planting a specimen tree, planting in groups, or planting a mass such as a border. When we're thinking of a specimen, we're wanting to select a site that we give that plant plenty of room. So there's a few ways we can set it off as a specimen. Give it a lot of room around the tree, but also the tree itself might have some unique characteristics such as this weeping form of the birch. Maybe the color of the foliage is very interesting, or the texture sets it apart from the rest of the landscape. With a mass planting, we use several plants of generally the same species, or at least plants that have very similar characteristics. We don't want to put a bunch of contrasting forms together. And the mass planting comes together to create a single unit. We're not just looking at one single tree, but the grouping of these. The Carolina buckthorn in our wildscape are a nice example of a group planting. Now right now they're fairly small and they seem very individual, but as they grow and mature, they'll come together into a group and provide some continuity through the garden. Many of our group plantings over time will grow together to create one large mass. One way that we use mass plantings in the landscape is as a border, and this is to provide a little bit of an edge to our landscape and a nice backdrop for other plantings. When placing a tree in the landscape, whether a single tree or a group, we want to carefully consider our location. We want to make sure, because trees grow to a very large size, we want it to have enough room both above ground and below ground. Some obstacles that the tree might encounter we need to avoid include overhead power lines or underground power lines, buildings and other structures, and paved surfaces. Now when it comes to power lines, we want to look up and down. Overhead lines and also those that run beneath the ground, which are actually more common in the home setting, need to be avoided. When it comes to an underground power line, we want to call Okie and have all the lines in our landscape marked, and that way we can use that as we choose a site for our tree. We want to maintain a minimum distance of 10 feet from underground lines. Now with the overhead lines, we need to give them a little bit more space. A general rule of thumb can be used based on the mature size of the tree. Remember, you could find information on mature size on the plant label, as well as in catalogs and books. For small trees that reach a mature size of under 25 feet, we want to place those a minimum of 20 feet from the power lines. For medium-sized trees that mature at a height of 35 to 50 feet, those need a little bit more room, giving them a minimum distance of 35 feet from the power lines. And then for our large trees that exceed 50 feet in canopy, we want to space those about 45 feet from the power lines. And what this will do is ensure that there's plenty of space for the full canopy to develop on that tree. The next thing we want to look at is tree placement relative to structures. When planting near buildings, we want to remember that a tree's root system can spread 2 to 3 times the width of its canopy. So we want to give it plenty of room for those roots to develop. A good way to determine how much space is needed is to identify the mature expected width of the plant and then divide that in half. So for our flowering plum, if its mature width is 20 feet, then we want to place it at a minimum of 10 feet from buildings. Of course, with a larger specimen, we want to give it a little bit more room to allow those roots to have plenty of room to develop. And we also don't want to encroach on the canopy and have to have some awkward pruning. Another thing we want to consider in placing a tree is paved surfaces in the landscape. That might be a sidewalk, a driveway, or a walkway. We often see pavement that's been buckled from a tree's roots growing underneath it. A minimum distance for placing a tree from a paved surface would be about 3 feet, but it's really ideal to give it even more room. A few additional things to avoid when we're placing a tree is to avoid blocking desirable views out into the landscape, such as from your home, and also blocking windows. From a safety perspective, we don't want to block views around corners or traffic signs to cause any vehicular problems. If you're planning to put in a vegetable garden, or maybe you already have one, make sure that when your tree reaches its mature size, it's not going to shade that garden. And finally, you want to avoid encroaching on your neighbor's property once that tree reaches its full maturity. Trees are really a long-term investment, so we want to be careful when we place them. You can consult a landscape architect or other professional to help you plan your landscape and properly place your trees.